And then we have reviews journals that are entirely dedicated to review the perspectives, like my journal. We have a portfolio of open access journals, like Nature Communications, now the communication journals and scientific reports. And in general, a good way of looking at this family of journals is thinking about how they're positioned in terms of selectivities versus breadth of scope, because Nature is obviously an interdisciplinary journal like Science. It's what makes them so appealing. It's articles that go out and they're read by everyone in science in principle. Anyone who's living through the issue, they will read about your research. These journals are also super selective because obviously everyone wants to publish there, but they only publish the best of the most interesting research. And Nature publishes around 800 papers per year. In the same multidisciplinary space, you have also journals like Nature Communications, which is still a selective journal. They reject around 80% of the submissions they receive, but it's a lot bigger. They publish around 6,000 papers per year. So you can see it's already a very different space. And then there is Scientific Reports, which is a journal. I don't know if you know it, but they only want papers to be technically correct. So basically everything is sent out for peer review. And if the peer reviewers don't find anything wrong with the paper, then the paper can be published, which means selectivity is extremely low and the volume is extremely big. It's around over 20,000 papers per year. And then when you move back to journals that are very selective, but now they're not aimed at the entire scientific community, but they're a little bit more specific, you find all the Nature journals. They have a very high rejection rate, similar to Nature, of around 90%. And there are journals that are a bit broader, like Nature Materials and Nature Chemistry, journals that are a bit more specific, like Nature Photonics, but they're all similarly placed in terms of selectivity. Obviously, the question when we talk about how many articles are rejected without peer review is what do the editors want to see? What are we looking for? And that's not a question that can be easily answered in a single slide, but that is something that maybe we can bring into the discussion as well. In one sentence, they want to see the type of significant advance that can change the thinking in the field. This can be a new idea, a new material that does something new, or it can be a new mechanistic understanding of a phenomenon that will be known for quite some time, but we never understood how it worked. It can also be a device. Maybe you come in with a very good idea on the technological side on how to make something work really well. That can also be a Nature or a Nature Physics paper. Obviously, there are big claims. There are also strong support that can keep those claims going. The editor looks, as we were discussing with Chris, the editor looks for something that looks important. We don't have the technical expertise to do what is the peer reviewer's job, which is checking if the appropriate methods have been used. But obviously, if you don't have the strong technical part in your paper, you might have your paper sent out for review, but it's unlikely that will end up being published. One common misunderstanding with authors is that it's obvious that anything that has not been done yet is new, but then not everything that's new is also automatically interested. And I think this is quite nicely summarized by this little cartoon that tells us that Newton discovering the law of gravity is a natural paper, very impactful, changes our understanding of the universe. But then a random dude looking at oranges falling and realizing that they also follow the law of gravity, that's the definition of an incremental advance. You take an idea, you apply it to a very similar system, that's okay, it hasn't been done before, but it's not as impactful as the first paper. And this is something we see a lot, where people say, oh, but this is new result, and it's similar to this other result you published. And like, yeah, exactly, it's similar to this other result we published. You're not the first person who thinks about this idea. A question that we get asked a lot is how important it is who is presenting the paper. Is it important if the authors have maybe never published big papers in this field, if they come from a small institution, if that's maybe not very well founded? And the answer is that no, the authors can be anyone. The idea is that the process should be completely independent on who is on the author list. Of course, this is the ideal world. The world is never ideal. There is always bias that goes into the process at the editorial level, at the peer reviewer level. So we all know that when the big group comes out with a big result, everybody gets excited immediately. And when the new group comes out with a similar result, people are like, oh, is this real? But it's very important to be aware of these biases, and we work quite a lot to try to realize that they're there and work past them. And yeah, everyone should have the same opportunities to publish their papers. As a review editor, I also included a slide about reviews, because maybe some of you at some point will think that it is a good time to write a new review on your research topic. And in this case, Nature editors would look for ideas that are timely. So there is a clear motivation why you want to write now. Something is happening in the field. There are interesting developments. There are some misunderstandings that need to be corrected. We want a review that aims at giving a good overview of the field, not just promoting your own work or just discarding some results from certain groups because you don't agree with them. We want something that gives readers a good overview of what's happening. But also we want that original angle where your review has a message that hasn't been given before. Because certain fields, like there are a lot of reviews being published, and certain fields are reviewed every month. You open Web of Science, new review on this field. So when you decide to write a review, because it's a lot of work to write a review, for me, the question is, what do you want to tell the community that hasn't been said before? And then you can write a review on a topic that's already well reviewed, but you have a new idea, some new insight that can make it still appealing for readers. Most reviews in Nature journals are invited, but by all means, that's not all of them. And my journal is maybe 70% invited and so 30% submitted. So if you ever think you have the right idea and you want to talk to editors, that's always possible. There is an editorial in Nature Reviews Chemistry. It's called By Invitation Only. It gives some tips about how to pitch a review. But otherwise, you can just go to the submission system, submit your idea, blurb, some references, and here if the editors want to hear more. Obviously, there is quite a bit of emphasis when talking about Nature journals about the fact that we don't publish incremental advances. And I just wanted to include a short slide to highlight the fact that it's not that Nature editors think that incremental advances are not important. A lot of the life-transforming technology we use is built on incremental advances. And this graph shows magnetic memory, the storage density from the 1950s. If you see this plot, obviously there isn't one massive leap that changed things, but it's a lot of small steps. And if you take those steps all together, you go from a computer that takes up an entire room to a laptop that you fit in your backpack and you take to work. And obviously, people want to publish those fancy papers that go in your CV, but I find nowadays there is too much emphasis into, oh, have you published the big paper, and giving positions or fellowships to people who have these kind of fancy publications, when in the end, the emphasis on science should be, are you doing something that you believe is important and questions that you think are interesting, and are you doing this in a way that's solid, reproducible, helpful for others? And it's important not to lose sight that Nature journals got a lot of influence over the years for many reasons, but there's a lot more to science than just getting that Nature publication. And now I have a few slides that go into a bit more detail about the editorial process at Nature journals. And I'm going to do this by taking as an example the Nature materials team. These are their faces. And the first thing to know is that Nature journals are all independent from one another. So they have their own access to their own submission system. We don't share information about what's going on with papers unless the authors ask us to, for example, if a paper is rejected, to find a home for it in a different journal. And every editorial team is built such that every editor, is normally 6 or 7 editors, have a different background. For example, in Nature materials, there is the optics person, there is the 2D materials person, the biomaterials person, because when the papers come in, they get assigned to the person who has the most experience in that area. The big question that the editors need to answer is, do we want to send it out for peer review? Because I was telling you, most papers are rejected without peer review. So that's where most of the editorial time goes in the end, making that judgment. Ideally, the first decision should take around 1 week. And most often the editor will discuss with a colleague from the same journal who can maybe give comments on something that that editor is not such an expert on, or maybe just give their opinion about the interest of the result. Some papers are quite easy to decide on. Some of them are very clearly similar to something that was done before. Some of them are very clearly groundbreaking if they're correct. Are quite a bit of thinking, because you want to go and check what else has been done in the space and try to understand and compare how different the new result is from previous results. So typically it can take a few hours to make up your mind about what you want to do with that paper. The tool that you have at your disposal to help the editor decide that they want to send your paper out for peer review is the cover letter. And the cover letter is something that I find is often a mystery for more junior researchers, because it's not always clear to people. You're submitting the paper and the paper is there. Why should you also write a letter? And obviously, historically, this is all because the papers were physically sent to the editorial office, and the cover letter was an actual letter saying, well, here you find enclosed these documents. And nowadays, it's a bit like, well, here is my paper. What else do you want to see? So some people get a bit confused, and we see a lot of cover letters that are just copy and paste of the abstract, which is not very useful because the abstract is already in the paper, or they just go on and on and on with the author telling you their life story about why this is so important, which is also not very helpful because editors don't have a lot of time. So the idea is that your cover letter is your 5 minutes along with the editor, and it's I see it as an elevator pitch. Now you can, in 2 or 3 paragraphs, highlight what is the one selling point of your paper, and highlight one, because most often your paper is a complete story that has a lot of results that you found along the way, and all of them are quite interesting. But what is the one thing that the editors and the readers should pay attention for? And this is the big step that your paper reports. So in your cover letter, you want to give a little bit of background about the field and what big question you want to answer in your research. And then you want to go into this one selling point, why it's important. And also it's useful to say why it's interesting for the readers of that journal, because that shows that you have thought about where you wanted to submit and you came to the conclusion that that is the best home for it. In the cover letter, you will also give some basic information about the paper. It can be a good place to suggest reviewers if you have suggestions, or exclude the reviewers if there's anybody that you don't want to give comments on your paper. The good news is that once the editor decides that your paper is interesting enough to be seen by the peer reviewers, more than half the papers are successful and eventually published. I say eventually because normally it is rarely a very straightforward process. Normally you have comments, you need to reply to them. There are more experiments or more calculations to do. So it's always a bit of a long and winded road, but there are at this point quite good chances, exactly because the initial screening is so strong. So it's already papers that, according to the editor's judgment, are interesting for the journal. For us, I think most of you might already be doing some peer review or helping with peer review. If not, this can be a great experience for you to get more involved into the publication system and understand a little bit better how it works. Most journals nowadays are quite happy for example, PIs to involve more junior people and who can help them with the assessment of the paper, and these people can be officially listed on the submission side. They can make their name public if they want, and then they can work together with their supervisor crafting the report, which can be quite interesting if you've never done it before, to develop your critical sense, but also by analyzing what you think are problems with other papers, deepen your understanding of the field. When writing a peer review report, the perfect report for us is a report that has a detailed assessment of the technical merits and problems of the paper, at least of the part you're an expert on. Obviously, if you're a theorist, you would not go and necessarily comment on all the aspects of the experimental results. But also in nature journals, we want to see what you think of the significance of the work, because for us it's important that people think that this is an exciting new development that other people need to hear about. Also, it's good to be on time. Normally, we ask reviewers to come back to us within 2 weeks, which is not a lot of time. You can ask for an extension, you can get 3 weeks, a month, but when you commit to a date, then it's good practice to stick to it, just because someone on the other hand is waiting for their reports. And I'm sure you've all been waiting for reports, and it's a time when people are refreshing their inbox continuously. So it's good for these things to come back in a timely way. It's good to be constructive in your report. Something that someone once told me is that in the end, all papers are published somewhere. And this is something that's important to keep in mind. If you're peer reviewing a paper for Nature Communications and you think it's by far not ready for that type of journal, then you know the authors are going to resubmit somewhere else. So if there are big flaws in the paper and you point them out in a constructive way, the result should be, if the authors hopefully take your comments on board, that that piece of work will be a little bit more complete, a little bit more solid, and it will be more helpful for whoever is going to read it and base their work on those results. When it comes to making a decision, Nature editors can decide to override peer reviewers or to give more weight to a report compared to another. For example, if we feel one peer reviewer has really given a lot of thought to the work and they have a lot of those constructive comments, and someone else might look a bit biased, either they're a bit too positive or a bit too negative, and they're making unfair criticism towards the work, we can decide that some reports we think are more solid than others, and we give more weight to them. We can also decide that one peer reviewer actually maybe has not understood the paper, maybe they're very aggressive, and we can decide that we're gonna disregard their reports if there are reasons to do so. So it's not a vote counting exercise where we have two positive reports and one negative and we automatically accept, but we have quite a lot of power to decide maybe to involve a new reviewer or just to evaluate the reports we have. Some people feel the peer review process is one where you submit a perfectly normal car, and after receiving reviewers' reports, you end up with a car with 8 wheels, a cannon on top, triangular windows that does not resemble very much your original product. But something that I think is positive is that when a survey was run among scientific reports authors asking whether they felt the peer review process had improved their paper, 92% of people said yes. And that's the aim of peer review, is just to get the paper more in shape, ask the questions that the readers might have when they read the paper. So it's quite useful to get that feedback in advance such that you can craft your paper a bit better before it's public. Like everything in life, peer review has pros and cons. It is a way of getting some multiple opinions on the paper to reduce bias. It's a check for technical correctness. It can catch mistakes. It can catch fraud, although it's not designed to catch fraud, and that's not how we should use it. And yeah, it is a good check for technical correctness. However, it's not an exact science. It's done by humans. It's not 100% objective because people have their own biases that the editor probably doesn't know about. And also, there is no consistent standard. Some people will write very good reports, very thoughtful. Some other people, they're in a hurry. They're receiving their third chaser saying, I was waiting for your report 3 weeks ago. And then they sit down, they write 3 lines, and they're done. And then you receive this report that's not very useful. But it's still is not working perfectly. I would say at the moment is still the only tested system that we have. But it is a big discussion in the community. What can we do to make it a little bit better? Obviously, not all submissions end with the desired outcome of publications, and sometimes your paper is rejected. Maybe by the editor who just thinks it's not important enough, maybe by the peer reviewers who think they didn't find that solid foundation in your experiments to support your claims. If you believe that the paper was rejected for the wrong reason, you always have the right to appeal. The only thing to be careful about is that appeals take a long time, because by design, new papers take precedence and appeals are looked at when there is a bit of time after evaluating all the new papers. So I would say there is a good editorial in Nature Physics called Leave to Appeal. It just gives you a little bit of insight about how editors look at appeal and when it's appropriate to appeal. I would say if the paper is rejected because the editor says it's not interesting, it's quite unlikely that an appeal will be successful. But if you think the editor has not understood the paper of your point, you maybe can try to appeal. Again, this is not very likely to succeed. You need to be very, very sure that no, this is really a Nature Nano paper, and this is the reason why, and you want the editor to reconsider. You always want to frame your discovery in a different way than in the paper, because the editor already read the paper and thought it wasn't very interesting. It's possible sometimes papers are not well written, and sometimes it's not that clear what the main selling point is. So if this is the case, if you think that was lost, first of all, you could have written more clearly, but also you want to frame it differently such that the editor gets, oh yeah, okay, I see, that is your point, not the point that you seem to be making, for example, in the introduction. A bit more likely to succeed are appeals after peer review, especially in cases where the peer reviewers ask for extra data and maybe you have the extra data or you can easily obtain it. And then you can appeal, just saying, well, we have these extra measurements that we did or extra calculation that we had in the drawer, and these actually addresses some of the concerns. Or sometimes there might be a reviewer that has misunderstood your point and you want to correct that misunderstanding. So in that case, you can send it back. The important thing is that in your appeal, you always want to add more factual information that the editor can think about. Some people appeal just by saying, I published so many papers in this field is so hot, this paper will cite so much, which it might all be true, and it's all not good reasons by themselves to go ahead with the paper. We're in a time of change with the publishing industry. I'm sure most of you are aware. There's lots of discussions about what we want to do with journals, big push towards open access in Europe, in the UK as well. There are mandates where if you're funded by a certain agency, you have to publish open access, which is the reason why now all nature journals have an open access option, because otherwise some people would be unable to publish with us. And more push towards data availability, code availability. Now, if you publish in a nature journal, but this is true for many other journals, you have to make the essential data, for example, the data that you're showing in your plot, available to readers, because readers need to be able to question your results, replot your data, reanalyze your data if they wish. And it's not considered acceptable anymore that data is available upon reasonable request, because we all know that then people ask for the data, and then sometimes the authors are very not forthcoming, like, well, okay, I need to think about it, what do you want it? And sometimes the data get lost because the student leaves and nobody knows where they've been saved. And it's just not good practice. That it doesn't help us advance in science. And there is a lot of experimentation about how to improve peer review. For example, Nature Communications is now publishing reports for all of their papers. The nature journals, if the reviewers want, they publish the names of the peer reviewers to give them credit, but also to let them take responsibility for maybe saying that the paper was interesting and correct. There are a lot of things going on, even more radical things, such as websites that basically they are preprint repositories, and then people can comment on that, and that can be used as reports, or the journals can directly pick preprints that they want to send out for review to try to see how the balance can be shifted. Because obviously, if you have professional editors, it's not necessarily a peer-to-peer system. So how do you do that evaluation of interest and to make the peer review process a little bit more transparent for readers? And now I would like to switch gears a little bit and tell you about careers in editorial. I will not talk too much because maybe it's more interesting if you ask me questions and then we take the discussion in the direction that you're more interested in. But the first thing to know is that the only requirement to become a nature editor is to have a PhD in a discipline that's relevant for the journal. And then we look for people who have a broad interest in science, people who want to hear about a lot of different results in different fields. So maybe the kind of personality who likes a broad overview rather than a deep understanding of a single topic, which is more the profile of the scientist who works in research. You would want to be quite good at interacting with other people, because there's a lot of interaction with authors, with colleagues, maybe with editors in other journals. And there is a bit of writing going on, but it's not essential to be able to write in perfect English, because depending on the role, if you're mostly making decisions on papers, obviously you want to be able to write well-crafted emails, but you're not a writer, you're not writing books. You're mostly there to judge the science, and then we have copy editors who can help correcting commas if anything is missed, for example, in research highlights. You would need to be someone who has quite a good attention to detail, who enjoys going through all the little things that are present in the paper, enjoy reading, obviously, because we do a lot of that. There is a creative side to the job, because there are a lot of projects editors are involved in. Editors need to be able to work with deadlines. We don't have massive amount of deadlines, but obviously we need to get an issue out at the end of the month. So sometimes it's about deciding when you're going to speed something up, where you're going to put the pressure, how you're going to use your time. And there are a lot of pros to a career in editorial. I could talk about this for a long time, but basically you see a lot of interesting results before anybody else. You have access to amazing scientists, because if I write to any PI saying I want to come and visit your lab, I'm coming through your city, they will try to make it happen for me, because they want that exposure to the science, they want to know what Nature editors are thinking. So you get to know a lot of people very quickly, and you get to hear about all their big ideas, what they're trying to do, sometimes what countries they're trying to do, about their new initiatives in material science. So it's very exciting. There's quite a bit of traveling, and also maybe this can resonate with PhD students and postdocs. It is a permanent job, and it has flexibility like academia does. So if you need to see the doctor at 4 p.m., you don't need to tell someone, oh, I need to be away for 2 hours. You just disappear and come back when you're ready. But then you do have the permanent contract. That is something that a lot of us are quite keen on. As I was saying at the beginning, Nature has a lot of different journals. And this means that there are a lot of positions and people come and go. So there are very often some open positions. I had a look a couple of days ago, what's open at the moment. There is, first of all, Nature Chemistry, this is probably relevant for this audience, has an opening for an inorganic chemist to work on their materials content. So that's great opportunity just across the road. Then Nature City is looking for editors, Nature Communications, Nature Biotechnology. And if you start thinking that this is a career you might be interested in, you can just turn on alerts, and chances are that at some point there will be one journal that's looking for someone in your area, and that can be a good match. And if you're ever interested in exploring this career, or if you want to know more about a specific role that's coming up, feel free to contact me. Also in the future, you can just save my email, or Yasmin will be able to give it to you if you decide that's something you want to explore, because we're always looking for new colleagues who are dynamic, coming out of academia, so knowing what are the latest things, trends, and things going on in the community. And yeah, I'm actually looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks for that really wonderful overview. So if anyone has any questions, either online, feel free to post them on the chat or unmute yourself, or in the audience here, feel free to raise your hand and ask any questions. I have dentists, so I can go start this until think about it. Let me just get the chat window open in case. So I don't know where to start, because there's different parts of it.
Yes.
But maybe since we're now on this career thing, I wanted to ask about the application process.
Yeah.
So every kind of place has its own unique style of applying, and usually for this kind of thing, you're trying to demonstrate different skills. So I was wondering, what is the kind of application process looking like? How would one prepare for it?
Yeah, it's not, that can change a little bit depending on the journal, but normally the first stage of application is quite simple. It's CV, cover letter, and often you need to submit a research highlight. But the idea is that because quite a lot of people want to apply, we want to do a first screening without having to look at all the documents. And some people, maybe they want to work in the London office, but they don't have the right to work. So we would clarify all those questions before. And then there is a step where there are manuscript tests, which for the reviews journals, you receive something to edit. And then you would need to generate some commissioning ideas just to see what thinking and like how you think about the problem. And for the research journals, they will send you normally free papers and ask you whether you would send them out for review and why.
Okay. So it's kind of testing you on the skills that are relevant to the job.
It's nice because I think it also gives people a flavor for what they would be doing. So some people really enjoy the test and they come to the interview very excited.
Yeah.
And some people, they don't really finish the test and they send things that are half done and like, oh, okay, this is how you're intending to work. Maybe you're not a great match.
Good to know. Okay. Yeah, Catherine. Do shout as loud as you can so that the owl can pick you up.
I was wondering, as we're saying, like, if you could edit how much what it would be, but you always need to understand the subjects. it's not like it's running temperature. How much better do you generally go in the things that like, is it something that you use your own kind of experience to be like, I've used it and kind of thought it's not great, but it's just like, or do you have to generally quite a bit of depth when it comes to it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it really depends on whether you know about the topic. And the areas are quite big because, as I said, a journal like Nature Materials has, I think, at the moment 7 editors. So the areas are relatively well defined, but even within those well-defined areas, there will be things that you're very familiar with and things that you're not familiar with. For example, I spent just 3 months with them because I was covering a paternity leave, but they gave me all their superconductivity and magnetism papers. And normally, like, there will be things that you're like, oh yeah, I know this field. Another thing where like, oh, this type of magnetism, I'm not sure what's happening, or this spintronic paper. So if you do know the field, obviously it's a lot easier for you because you already have references in mind saying, yeah, I know this is a big question versus, yeah, I remember this was published last year. So this makes your life easier. If you get a paper and you don't know a lot about it, then you will need to read around the topic and find out what's going on. And normally what happens is that you would write a technical assessment of the paper, or just you would write a couple of paragraphs saying, well, this is what the authors are trying to do, and this is what other papers have done and how it compares, in your opinion, with references. And that's something that you normally circulate to a colleague or store in the system. This is something that you don't send to the authors just because experience shows that the more details you give with your rejection, the more details you get back in the appeal, because people just go point by point saying, no, paper in reference 1, actually the material was slightly different, in reference to the technique was slightly different. Like, yeah, I know, and I still want to reject. So normally then to the authors, you would pick one thing that for you is the biggest reason to reject and say, well, I think this is too similar to this other work. But then in a way, you're expected to produce this paragraph of explanation because it's a good way of reminding you, well, did you check all these different things? And if you're unable to formulate that paragraph clearly, then you realize that maybe you didn't do as much research as you should have. We have a question in the chat.
Yes, do you want to read it out or should I?
I can read it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this nice talk. I have a question about how an editor usually do decide if the paper is high impact or just incremental. Will, yes, that's a good question. Artificial intelligence models in the future be helpful for recognizing high impact papers? Yeah, that's actually, it's a very timely question. First part of the answer is it's once you start going into the details, and when I give longer talks, sometimes there is a little exercise where people have to evaluate abstracts and decide what's high impact and what's not high impact. Is not super difficult if you have enough information and if you understand that information, because I found from my time in Nature Materials, sometimes that's a little bit, that it becomes complicated when the subject matter is very complex, and then it's hard to understand exactly what each paper found. But if you are clear about what everything means and you put it all together, you get a sense quite quickly for where the editorial of the journal is, just by seeing everything as it was published in the past. And you're basically looking for that result that people in the field will think like, oh, this is really cool, it's quite unexpected, versus, yeah, of course, if you do this, you obtain that, because we know that it works in all these other cases, so it's not as surprising. Artificial intelligence is obviously something that is working surprisingly well. It can do many things. Will it be able to identify high impact papers? I think in principle, I don't see why not. The issue with these tools is you need to formulate your questions very clearly, because the output you get is only as good as the input you get. So if you're not very clear about what you're asking it, you might get jumbled answers. And in principle, I don't see why it shouldn't be able to give that kind of assessment. I was seeing on Twitter yesterday, someone put their entire paper into ChatGPT and asked it, well, can you give reviewer comments basically on this paper? And they found that the comments were quite helpful. And the paper had already been peer reviewed. And so apparently some of the comments had already came up in the real peer review. So obviously these things have access to all the information that we need to Google and read and understand. So it can input all that information in. The problem is that it is still a tool and we don't have full control about what it's doing. So for me, it probably will become something that's very helpful for journals to evaluate things, maybe to identify potential reviewers, maybe to identify potential issues. But if you want to do a good work, I think we will always need a human stage where you say, okay, this is what the tool thinks, and do I agree based on my own research? And that can cut down the time by 80% probably. But if you just believe, because this thing will always give you answer. You ask them, can you suggest 10 experts in this area? It always suggests 10 experts because that's what it does. Are they really experts in this area? Maybe not, because maybe you cannot find it, but it doesn't tell you. Actually, number 9 and number 10, like I have a big error bar here. No, it's just like one names, here are names. So it's important to, I think it's something that in general, in every profession, it will be quite useful as an interface to get more information.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Was there someone online? The person asking the question. Well, then you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. I have my alternative, I think. It's not what it happens. I don't think that before the policy is to be by. It's not about the flag, it's also about everything I can compare to the cross sides, and I know like. It is good, but this did, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, that's all. For us, as another, it's working, I don't know, area being. And us, they're all areas. All the lowest, but.
Yeah, that's also an interesting question because you're right. There are topics that at some point they become very hot, and then we see them every single week in nature. And sometimes, if you don't work exactly on the topic, at some point you start thinking like, oh, I mean, this is quite technical. Like, why is it so important? But then part of the thinking is that because so many people are entering the field, and because everyone is so exciting. And because it's a new field, so there are a lot of low-hanging fruit. So at the beginning, everyone is trying the simple things and finding interesting results. And it's all like, oh, okay, now I find this known effect with this new material or this new effect. And there are like in these twisted layers or the degree of freedoms, and you can do a lot of characterization of fundamental physics. So obviously the editor sees it, and it tends to be new things because it's systems that at the beginning only a few groups have the clean systems. But there's also one thing to be slightly careful about, that at some point when the community is overexcited, when you send things out for peer review, everybody like, yeah, fantastic, and your results in our field. And also some fields people are more clever than in other fields, because in some fields people realize that if they get more papers out in Nature, everyone can benefit from more funding, because then you can say, this field is so important, we publish in Nature and in Nature Botanics and in Nature Materials, and this looks good. And there are communities who do this quite a lot, and you need to be aware of this, because then if your rejection rate after peer review is normally 40%, and you start noticing that this other field is 10%, you just want to maybe be a bit more selective with the papers you send out. And there are communities where people just want to kill every single paper just because it's from their competitors. That's what you're doing now. Nobody can publish anymore. And it's, like, the dynamics is something that I find quite interesting to observe, because I think this is a very good case where working together gives much better results than always working against one another. But as an editor, you need to know that there are topics where suddenly anything you send out for review, everybody says that, it's great, if they can fix these technical things, it should get in Nature. Because at some point you don't want to publish one single topic for a year, and you want to leave such spaces for people who are not working on that. And in general, there are topics that go in Nature a lot, but then I think there's still very high risk to start working on those topics, just because you enter a field where everybody is trying to do the same thing. So even if you do them well, chances are by the time you submit, someone submitted the exact same result a month ago, and then now you wasted 6 or 7 months optimizing a system that is like, oh, it's not you anymore.
Maybe slightly related. So you made your point that there's all different topics. You kind of used to go through this beginning, and it makes it tough. You skip over biology and stuff. So is that core that like listen, like those sort of sections there? Is that just how it looks out the balance between say another risk we've got to revive industry versus some especially overall beginning?
It is quite structured. That's actually an interesting question that I'm not super sure, but they obviously have different teams,
Yeah.
and the different teams have a page allocation per year. So the idea that physics always get a certain percentage of the journal, which is where it becomes very weird, because obviously you don't have control about how many good papers you get. So it's hard to fill those quotas exactly. But there is a part where if suddenly someone has too many good papers, someone will say, look, you need to slow down a little bit. Can you be slightly more selective?
But it does seem that material science is driving it. You're seeing many
Yes.
people, like getting material science, and they need to find an intersection.
That's definitely by design, because historically Nature is much more of a biological journal. And then at some point they decided, well, wait a second, we need to capture all these other science. So there was an effort to hire more editors in material science, and these people, they just go around and tell people, oh, this looks interesting, they want to send it to us to really expand the reach.
So I have a question that is, so here there's probably some people who do experiments, but there's probably a lot of people who do modeling and calculation. And there's this kind of idea that the general recipe, let's say, often, not always, but often getting into a high impact journal is to collaborate with experimentalists. But then I was thinking about sort of theory only papers, right? Or calculate modeling only papers. Presumably there's also a kind of recipe on the editor side where you tend to seek experimental reviewer. But I don't know if this is just the kind of rumor that I've heard in my life, that usually if you apply to a high impact journal with a modeling paper, you should expect to be reviewed by not only people who are experts in modeling, but also experimentalists. So I wonder if you could comment on the general kind of how to approach modeling paper from an editor's perspective.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something I've never encountered. It would have come to my mind to ask an experimentalist, but then obviously it also depends on what you're modeling, because what I can see as a Nature journal theory only paper is, for example, you suggest a new type of material. I'm thinking about papers that were very influential, like the one on topological insulator. Like you come with this big idea and you have some hints about how we can reach them. So it's not actually stupid, because those papers, from an editorial point of view, they're interesting only if there is some idea of feasibility. So if you're suggesting material that can never be synthesized, like, well, thank you, this is a great idea. So it actually makes sense. I never thought about it, but yeah, probably I would look for someone who's that kind of. There are people who are maybe experimentalists who work a lot with theorists, and they like doing these explorations and being directed by theorists. And yeah, that's actually not a bad idea for the reality check.
Yeah.
Because it's very hard to get theory only papers in Nature journals, because there's always this suspicion where, okay, you did the theory, but is this real?
Hence the recipe of collaborating with experimentalists in that case to see something is feasible.
That's right. It's just like always, it's not always that easy. It can add a lot of time. Maybe the experimentalists have a different agenda. And also sometimes the theory tends to go a little bit in the background always. So if you're trying to put out the big theoretical idea, I can see why sometimes people would want to actually write that paper. That's their paper. Yeah,
Maybe on the kind of same topic, how likely is it that a paper that has only predictions, maybe like in a hot topics, could go through? Because at the end, it's still, those are still only predictions. So how likely is it that it goes to like being published?
It's hard.
Yeah.
It can happen if the idea sounds important enough. And I think the flip side is nowadays you see few experimental papers that have no theoretical support at all. So it just, science is evolving towards being a lot more connected, and papers have more and more parts, which is also something that sometimes we try to analyze. Papers have more and more authors because now you have 3 different characterization methods, 1 or 2 different theoretical methods, because there is this idea that for the Nature paper, you want to really look at everything. But there have been papers that have been successful at Nature journals because it was an important message. You need to convince the editor. Sometimes you need to know the editors, because that becomes a lot of personal preference. Some editors will think they want to take that risk, and some editors not. So that's something that you might want to talk to colleagues and find out which is the journal who's interested. And obviously, we also have journals that are theory only, like Nature Computational Sciences, but that's more for I think the algorithmic side. Sometimes you really want to focus on the materials.
Just say, anything possible to get papers in nature itself and the nature materials.
Yeah.
So Andy Ross and I had a paper like a year ago, and then with engagement, obviously we had a paper that's purely.
Yeah.
But the question I have actually about sort of methods for,
Yeah.
because that seems like an area that's highly impactful.
Yes.
Side, but almost absent in the top tier journals. So there's any, is that maybe if we don't send you our big methods, but I've never seen one. The first one is finding itself the same thing.
That's a great point. I do agree with you. I don't think those papers tend to come to us. And yeah, I think it's a bit, people think in certain ways, and there are types of papers that it's hard for us to attract.
It's a big long and technical papers. Big long these kind of the equation of 1,000.
Yeah. I don't think there is a fundamental reason why they wouldn't, especially if it's a method that's quite clearly gonna be helpful for a lot of people, because this happens with experimental new method. They do end up in nature journals, and then everybody, then you see 20 papers using that method on this and that and that and that and that.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry, I'm a PhD student, so from a PhD student's perspective, if we would like to pursue a career like being an editor, what kind of skills we need to develop during our training? Because from my own experience, we are working on very specific projects.
Yeah.
So as you mentioned before, you need to have a general interest in science as an editor. So what should we do in order to develop ourselves? Yes.
Yeah, I think I would say keeping that interest open is very important. One thing that can be helpful is just reading outside your area, for example, skimming through Nature and Science, having an idea of what's happening, what is the science news. Because one question I always ask at interviews, and it's surprising how many people cannot answer it, is, can you give me 2 examples of important developments in material science over the past 2 years? And half the candidates cannot think of a single thing that's not in their specific field. I mean, guys, and in some years there are massive things happening. Like, how have you heard of it? And of course, I've heard of that, but it doesn't come to their mind. And that's the kind of thing where you want to be prepared to be able to have conversation where people ask you, what's growing, what's hot? And they're like, well, there is, this field that people are interested in. And the other thing is that you could get yourself involved into activities that are a bit broader, such as what Yasmin is saying. Organized seminar series is a great way to get exposed to different topics, meet the speakers, and then in your CV, you can show that you did a little bit more than just your research, because this shows an interest in science beyond writing your own papers. So sometimes there is, you can get with people, you can co-organize, for example, symposia at the big conference like the MRS, or the German Physical Society meeting. You can, if there is funding, maybe organize a summer school or a winter school, or if there is smaller funding, organize the seminars for your department. And that just shows that you have that entrepreneurial spirit where, like, well, what are the opportunities that I can grab?
I will then, on the back of that, just out of TYC advertisement there, that we do have a journal club, which everyone is very welcome to attend. It's gone a bit quiet because we've been so busy with forms this month, but we're trying to do it every 2 weeks. We can even do it every week. It happens over at physics. It's open to everyone. Anyone can suggest a paper. And actually, Journal Club is where one of your colleagues, Gabriel, who I know very well, got also interested in this way, where I would say that journal clubs, especially the one that TYC holds, are very unique in that it's not a lot of pressure on you as individuals to go away and study this paper. It's more about us coming together on a suggested paper, discussing it, criticizing it, maybe discussing, does it belong in this journal, would it have been better somewhere else, and wondering about a lot of the aspects that you're talking about. So if anyone is interested in that trend, I would definitely recommend you to start coming to journal clubs or suggesting papers over there. All of those things that you mentioned, within your departments, and also the TYC is very supportive of this if you have some ideas. Yeah. And we often provide cookies and coffee.
That's the key in academia.
Any other questions you might have from the audience or online? Yeah.
Do you need to have a PhD when you start applying?
You don't.
No,
No.
It's not like an automatic requirement.
No, you just need, when you're at the stage of the interview where they might not be offering you the position, at some point they want to make sure you are gonna finish your PhD. So you want to be at the stage where it's almost finished. But for example, I started before discussing before my Viva. But then my chief editor at the time, she said, well, we can do this because they were in a bit of a hurry. Like, yeah, we want to hire you, but I want you to submit your thesis before you come to London. Because she was just worried that at some point people can get lost trying to do too many things. But also, I know of a colleague where they're trying to hire someone who still has quite a lot of time to go on their PhD, and they're gonna take up a part-time position so they can finish their PhD and start working on the journal, which I personally don't think is a good idea. But it's two things that are very involved mentally. So I would focus on one and then the other. But if your PhD is almost finished, also because often there are parts where you're not doing that much and you're not actively doing new things or writing new code. Maybe you're just wrapping up your thesis. And also, maybe I shouldn't say this, but once you have a job lined up, you can just finish your thesis a little bit more quickly. You want to make sure the results are there. But in my case, because most of it was published, you're like, okay, let's summarize all these papers because I don't need this thesis to get a postdoctoral position. I just need it done so I can move on to the next step. So by all means, you can apply while you're doing your PhD.
Yeah, Chris?
I'm going to ask about working styles, so sort of work from home, the office very still how things settle out.
It's a mix. Now we need to go to the office at least once a week, but most people come twice a week. And the idea is that there are focus days, which is Tuesday, for example, but a lot of people are in. So if you organize social events, it's on Tuesdays, but we can work from home 2 or 3 days a week, which is quite nice. I find there are things that is a lot better to do at home and things that is a lot better to do in the office, but that interaction with people, it just, we cannot skip it. It just, there are so many ideas and so many opportunities.
And what fraction do you find you traveling there?
Too much. I don't know.
I think out of every email I send you, maybe 50% reached an automatic.
Maybe we need not that's why I can do this.
No, absolutely. In general, an editor would do 2 big trips a year because we have a travel budget that's preset. So whatever we can fit within our budget, and that's it can be maybe a big conference like the American Physical Society, a Gordon conference, and maybe a workshop in Cambridge that's just 2 days. That would be typical. But then when you get to a chief editor position, especially if you travel a lot, then people start inviting you and saying, do you want to come to our conference and give a talk and we can cover your expenses? And then it quickly sums up to I'm never done. Which is, to me, is one of the fun parts of the job, just seeing how people are working in different countries and what they're trying to do.
I have a very simple question. I'm always impressed by these companies that have all these international offices all over the world. Presumably the core of the work still happens in the English language, but just to know, like that's always at work, at least that's the language that would be, if someone wanted to, let's say, apply, I don't know, in Germany or China or somewhere, which would be.
Yeah, I
have any
think
idea about that?
the German office is an interesting case because we opened this office in Berlin a month after Brexit. The company keeps saying this has nothing to do with Brexit, but in practice, we hired a lot of people in Berlin because we couldn't get visas for people to come to London. So the Berlin office is full of people who are not German at all. So I think most people speak English just because not enough people speak German. But I think if you went to the Italian office, which I've never visited, you would find out that people are speaking Italian because no one is moving to the Italian office if they're not Italian.
But
So,
like your work, let's say, is still because of the nature of communication.
yeah, you would still write emails in English and everything. Although we do have also spin-off services like Nature India or Nature Italy that are websites that collect science news. For example, Nature Italy is both in Italian and English, and we have Nature Asia. There is Nature Japan that's both in English and Japanese. But it's something that editors are not directly involved in. Nature is a massive company, which I think is one of the benefits of working at Nature, is that there are so many roles you can go to if at some point you're bored with whatever you're doing. So that would be something that to do something different, then you move on to your own language. I think there is one in Arabic, I don't remember what it's called, but it's there's we do almost everything you can think of. somehow.
Yeah. Impressively big.
It's very big, yes.
Thank you. Any other questions? Online or here in the audience? If not, I think so. There's plenty of sandwiches and drinks left at the back. Please feel free to enjoy for the next, I think 15-20 minutes, and then after that they will disappear. Thank you so much again, Julia, for coming and
Thank you for
talking to us.
hosting
It's
me.
been really enlightening. So this. Thanks, everyone. I will stop the recording now.
I remembering to start it, remembering to stop.
Yes.